The thing I remember most clearly is the perfume. Not the sound of the door. I'd slept through that. Not the creak of the third stair, which had announced every late arrival in our house for 11 years. I remember the smell. Something floral and sharp cutting through the stale dark of the bedroom. A scent too deliberate for midnight, too composed for a woman who'd told me she was spending the evening at her sister Renee's place, watching whatever home renovation show they'd been obsessed with that month. I lay still, eyes closed. The numbers on the nightstand clock read 2:07 a.m. in hard red light. Diane moved carefully in the dark, the kind of careful that isn't natural, that has to be practiced. I heard the soft compression of the bathroom door, the click of the latch catching without a sound. A sliver of yellow light appeared beneath it. Water ran. She was washing something off. I told myself. She probably had a glass of wine. Didn't want to wake me. Nothing unusual. Renee lived 40 minutes away. It wasn't impossible. I told myself a lot of things that night. We'd been married 12 years. I was 41, a structural engineer for a mid-sized consulting firm in Clarksburg, the kind of work that filled long weeks and left weekends blurry. Diane was 38, a part-time office administrator for a dental group, though she'd cut her hours the previous spring to be home more for our daughter Cora, who was 9 and in the 3rd grade and obsessed with horses she'd never be allowed to own. We lived in a colonial on Birch Hollow Road with a porch that sagged slightly on the left side. A detail I kept meaning to fix and kept not fixing. The kind of house you grow into rather than choose. Ours had been, for most of those 12 years, a good marriage. Not the kind that gets written about. The kind that gets quietly lived. I'd met Diane at a university alumni event neither of us had wanted to attend. She laughed at something I said. Something genuinely funny, I think, though I can no longer remember what. And that laugh had felt like a door opening in a room I hadn't known was sealed. We married 22 months later. Cora arrived when Diane was 29, ahead of schedule, a fact that reorganized our lives entirely and that we'd never once regretted. Lately, there had been something. Not a crack exactly. More like a film of distance that settles on glass in winter. You don't see it accumulating, you just notice one morning that the view isn't sharp anymore. She'd been distracted since early spring. I'd put it down to Renee's divorce proceedings, which had been grinding on since January and which dominated every family conversation. Diane had been Renee's primary emotional support, phone calls that lasted past 10, sudden trips across town on Tuesday afternoons, a general emotional bandwidth directed elsewhere. I'd understood that. I'd even admired it, the way she showed up for people. But the perfume at 2 a.m. didn't belong to that story. I was still pretending to sleep when she came back to bed. She slid in with the same deliberate quiet, and I caught it again. That floral edge slightly softened now, as if she'd washed her neck but not her hair. She settled on her side, facing away from me. Within 10 minutes, her breathing had evened into sleep, or a convincing impression of it. I lay there another hour watching the red numbers change. In the morning, she made coffee and scrambled eggs and asked me twice if I'd slept well, which she hadn't done in months. Cora sat at the table with a library book about Appaloosa horses and read aloud passages that no one asked her to. The kitchen smelled of butter and toast and ordinary Tuesday life. Diane was warm, present. She touched my arm when she refilled my mug. It was the most unsettled I'd felt in years. "How was Renee?" I asked. "Tired," she said, not looking up from the pan. "She's not sleeping well. We talked mostly. Watched half a show." "Which one?" "A beat. Barely half a second. That kitchen renovation one. The one with the couple in Nashville." She smiled at me then, and it reached her eyes, and I thought, I am making something out of nothing. I thought, you're a man who notices a smell and builds a case. I drove to work with the radio off. My colleague Pete had been my closest friend for 9 years. We'd started at the firm the same month, weathered 3 restructurings, and traded enough brutal honesty over enough bad coffee to skip most social pretense. He noticed something was off before I'd said a word. "You look like a man who slept but didn't rest," he said, dropping into the chair across my desk. "Long night." He waited. Pete had a gift for silence that most people mistake for patience. Really, it was precision. He knew when to push and when to let gravity do the work. "Diane got home late," I said. "From Renee's." How late? After 2. He looked at me with the careful expression of someone who understands the difference between what a man says and what a man means. Renee lives in Grafton. That's 40 minutes. I know. Marcus. I know, I said again, and I poured more coffee and opened a set of load-bearing calculations and refused to think about it for the rest of the morning. But that evening, standing in the driveway collecting the mail, I noticed Diane's car. The driver's seat had been moved back 2 inches. Diane was 5'4". She kept the seat close to the wheel always. I was 6 feet even. I'd driven her car to the pharmacy 3 weeks ago and adjusted it. She hadn't reset it since then. Or someone else had. I stood in the driveway for a long moment with a grocery circular in my hand and the late April air turning cool around me and a very specific feeling. Not yet fear, not yet certainty. Settling into my chest like concrete beginning to set. The weeks after that night had a texture I can only describe as double exposed. 2 images overlaid on the same film. There was the surface life. Dinner conversations, Cora's school projects, the slow renovation of the back porch I'd finally started. And underneath it, threading through everything like a secondary electrical system, was the quiet accumulation of things that didn't fit. I didn't confront Diane. Not yet. That's important to understand, not because I was cowardly, but because I am, fundamentally, an engineer. I don't act on hypothesis. I look for structural evidence before I make a judgment call. The first thing I did was begin to actually pay attention. That sounds simple. It isn't. 12 years of marriage builds a kind of comfortable blindness. You stop cataloging your partner the way you once did. You stop noticing what they wear, where they look, how long they pause before answering. You trust the established pattern and stop reading the data. I'd done that. I'd been doing it for years, probably. Now I reversed it. Diane's phone had always been accessible. She'd never been secretive about it. She'd hand it to me to look up directions, leave it on the counter while she showered, use it at the table without angling it away from me. Sometime in late March, that had changed. The phone stayed in her cardigan pocket or face down on whatever surface was nearest. Not dramatically, just consistently. She was also sleeping better. This was the one that genuinely surprised me, because it moved opposite to what I expected. If she were hiding something, guilt, anxiety, the specific weight of deception, I'd have expected restlessness. Instead, she was sleeping soundly, eating well, laughing more easily. She bought a new pair of shoes, dark green, impractical for anything Clarksburg offered. She started listening to a French cafe playlist through the kitchen speaker on weekend mornings. Something she'd never done before. She seemed, in every visible way, lighter. That lightness was its own kind of evidence. I started paying attention to timing. The Tuesday evenings at Renee's had been happening since January, but I realized I couldn't actually confirm they'd been at Renee's. I'd assumed. Diane had said it, I'd filed it, I'd moved on. Now I thought back and counted 6 Tuesdays over the past 2 months where she'd been out past 10. 3 of them past midnight. I'd been home with Cora each time, which meant I couldn't verify anything without involving my daughter in something she was far too young to carry. Renee was another problem. We'd always gotten along fine. She was warmer than Diane in some ways, more openly emotional, the kind of woman who cried at commercials and meant it. But since her divorce proceedings had begun, she'd been raw and complicated, and I'd respected that rawness by keeping some distance. Now I needed to test something without alerting either of them. I called Renee on a Wednesday morning, telling myself I was checking in. We talked for 15 minutes. Her lawyer had filed something. There was a dispute over the car. She was furious but functional. Natural conversation. Then, toward the end, I said, "Diane said you two had a good talk Sunday." There was a pause. "Sunday," Renee said. "I didn't see her Sunday. I've been in Morgantown since Friday. My mom had a procedure." I said, "Oh, I must have the days mixed up. She mentioned it this week. Maybe it was the week before." "Maybe," Renee said, uncertain, then moved on. I sat with that for a long time. It wasn't confirmation. Renee could have forgotten. Diane might have misspoken. The weeks had been blurring together. I was still working inside the territory of reasonable explanation, and I knew it. I knew that the danger of suspicion is that it makes everything look like proof, the way hunger makes everything look like food. I didn't want to destroy 12 years on a misremembered Sunday. But then Cora said something. She said it at dinner, without any awareness of what she was handing me. She was talking about a drawing she'd made at school. A horse, brown with white spots. And she said, "I made it for the man Mommy knows. The one with the glasses who fixed our car that time." Diane went very still. The kind of still that is the opposite of peace. "What man, baby?" I asked. My voice came out level. I was surprised by that. "The one who waved at us in the parking lot," Cora said, dragging a piece of bread through her pasta sauce. "At the food store. He had a nice smile. He said my backpack was cool." "When was that?" I said. "I don't know. Before Easter." I looked at Diane. She was cutting something on her plate that didn't need cutting. "Just someone I know from the dental office," she said. "Patient." He recognized me. Cora had already moved on to describing the horse's eyes in her drawing. The conversation slid forward and away, the way family dinner conversations do. But I had seen Diane's face in that half second before she answered. That flicker of something organized, something prepared. And it had not been the expression of a woman recalling a forgettable acquaintance. That night I called Pete from the driveway at 9:30. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What do you need?" "I need to know who she's actually seeing on Tuesdays," I said. "That's going to cost you something," he said. "Not money. Something else." "I know." He meant certainty. He meant I was going to find out something I couldn't unfind. We both understood that. He'd been through his own version of it with his first marriage, back before I knew him. A story he'd told me once in parts, over separate evenings, never the whole thing at once. "You sure?" he asked. The porch light buzzed softly above my head. Somewhere down Birch Hollow a dog was barking at nothing. The air smelled of new grass and cold concrete. "No," I said. "Do it anyway." Pete moved carefully. He was a methodical man by nature. The same quality that made him a good engineer made him a good investigator of uncomfortable things. He didn't follow Diane himself. He knew someone who did. A former colleague, now in private security, who owed him a favor so old both of them had stopped mentioning it. The name came back inside a week. Joel, 44, divorced. An architect with a small firm out of Morgantown, but he kept a workspace in Clarksburg 3 days a week. Had for the past 8 months, which I found notable. He'd gone to the same state university as Diane, 2 years ahead of her, though I couldn't verify whether they'd known each other then or reconnected later. His social media was spare and curated. Projects, travel, a ski trip in February. No wife in any image. No explanation of why a Morgantown architect needed a satellite office in Clarksburg. I recognized the name, just barely. Diane had mentioned a Joel once, maybe 18 months ago, something about running into someone from college at a conference the dental group had sponsored. She'd described him in the way you describe people who don't matter, briefly, without detail. I'd absorbed it the way you absorb wallpaper. Filed it at 0 significance. That was my first real mistake. Not the last. The photo Pete's contact sent was taken in a parking lot outside a restaurant called Bardo's, on the north side of town. Diane and Joel stood near a dark gray sedan, his, I assumed, talking. Not touching. Not kissing. Just talking. She was laughing at something and her hand was near her collarbone the way it got when she was genuinely amused. A gesture I'd watched 1,000 times. A gesture that belonged to our life together, and seeing it directed at someone else was the first clean, unambiguous pain I'd felt since this had started. Everything before had been the dull ache of suspicion. This was sharp, but it wasn't proof of anything actionable. 2 people in a parking lot. That was all. I sat on that photograph for 4 days. I looked at it a lot, not obsessively but clinically, the way I'd examine a structural diagram for the thing that didn't add up. I was looking for something beyond the obvious, and what I found, eventually, was the detail I'd almost missed. Diane's car was not in that parking lot. She'd told me that particular Tuesday she was at Renee's. She would have driven herself or been dropped off. But in the background of the photo, parked 30 feet behind them, was Renee's silver Hyundai. Renee had driven her there. Renee knew. The shape of the thing I was dealing with shifted considerably in that moment. It wasn't just a wife and a man in a parking lot. It was a system, an arrangement with moving parts and at least one other person's knowledge and cooperation. The sister who'd been leaning on Diane for emotional support during her divorce was also, apparently, providing cover for whatever this was. I thought about that for a long time before I felt anything other than a kind of cold architectural interest in the structure of it. Then I felt the betrayal hit me in two directions at once, which is a particular kind of pain I don't recommend to anyone. There were, even then, things that didn't track. Joel's Clarksburg office had opened 8 months ago. That was around October, around the same time Diane had started being more present at home, not less. If they'd been involved for 8 months, her behavior didn't fit the pattern I'd have expected. The pulled-away wife, the dropped intimacy, the emotional vacancy, those had only started in late winter, maybe February or early March. Either the relationship had started recently, or it had existed in some other form longer and had recently escalated. Or, and this thought arrived uninvited and refused to leave, Joel's presence in Clarksburg was not entirely for Diane's sake. He'd mentioned a project in the photo caption I'd found. A municipal renovation bid. That was legitimate, verifiable. Maybe he'd been here for work and they'd reconnected. Maybe it had started small and grown. Maybe I was still looking for a version of this that hurt less. Pete told me to stop theorizing and get something solid. He was right. I'd been engineering explanations instead of gathering facts, which is the kind of cognitive error that gets buildings condemned. So I did something I'm not proud of. I went through Diane's laptop on a Thursday afternoon when she'd taken Cora to a writing lesson at a stable 20 minutes out of town. I wasn't searching for messages. I didn't know her passwords and I wasn't going to spend an hour guessing. What I wanted was her browsing history, which she'd never thought to clear because she'd never thought I'd look. There were restaurant reservations. Barretto's 3 times. Once in late February, once in March, once 2 weeks ago. All Tuesday evenings. Booked for 2. There was also a search, Weekend Getaway Cabins Canaan Valley WV. Dated 6 days ago. She wasn't planning a family trip. Cora had school on Mondays. I had a site visit scheduled for the last weekend of May that she knew about. She hadn't mentioned anything about a trip to me. I closed the laptop and sat in her office chair. A blue ergonomic thing she'd ordered herself 3 years ago, the right armrest slightly repaired with black tape, and I looked at the framed photo on her desk. Cora at 6, missing both front teeth, holding a stuffed horse. Me at her side, squinting into summer sun. One arm around my daughter and one around a woman I thought I fully understood. I sat there until I heard the car in the driveway. I had thought that certainty would feel different, cleaner, like a diagnosis that finally gives the symptoms a name. Instead, it felt like learning that the foundation of a structure you'd built your life inside had been settling for years, slow, invisible, and now suddenly irrevocably measurable. I knew enough. I didn't know everything, but I knew enough to understand that what was happening was not a mistake or a drifting, not an emotional friendship that had softened towards something ambiguous. It was deliberate, it was planned, and it had been running long enough to have its own logistics. What I hadn't decided was what to do with what I knew. Pete came over on a Friday night, nominally to watch the game, actually to help me think. Diane took Cora to a birthday party, a classmates' event at one of those inflatable play places out on Route 50 that she'd mentioned 2 weeks in advance and followed through on without deviation. Whatever else was happening in our marriage, she was still, in every visible dimension, a good mother. I held on to that. It complicated the simple version of what I was feeling. Pete sat with a beer he didn't finish and listened while I laid out what I had. The timeline, the reservations, the photo, Renee's involvement. When I finished, he said, "The cabin search is the one that matters." Why? Because the restaurant is retrospective, he said. You can tell yourself the restaurant was just meals. But looking for a weekend cabin means she's planning a future with him. That's not the same animal. He was right. That was the distinction I'd been circling without landing on. Barretto's was evidence of the present. The cabin search was evidence of intention. She doesn't know you know anything? He asked. Nothing. She's been completely normal. He thought about that. What do you want to happen, Marcus? Not what should happen. What do you actually want? I didn't answer for a long time. Outside, a car passed on the street. The porch light was back on. I'd finally replaced the bulb. I want to not have to want anything, I said. I want to go back to 6 months ago and not be in this conversation. That's not one of the options, he said. I knew that. I'd known it for weeks. But there's a difference between knowing something and accepting that knowing it means you have to act. The next morning, a Saturday, Diane told me she needed to go see Renee, that Renee was having a difficult weekend and needed company. She said it at breakfast, over the same table where Cora had described the man with the glasses, and her voice was level and warm and entirely believable. I said, "Of course. Take your time." She kissed me on the cheek. She smelled like the same perfume from that first night, the one that had woken me at 2 a.m. and started all of this. I stood in the kitchen and listened to her car leave the driveway. Then I called Renee. "Is Diane with you?" I asked before she could say anything. A long pause, longer than any innocent pause would need to be. "Marcus," she said. "Renee." Another pause. She asked me to cover for her. I didn't think. I told her it wasn't a good idea. "I want you to know I said that." "I'm sure you did," I said. My voice was very quiet. "Where is she?" "I don't know exactly. She said she'd be back by 6. "Is she with Joel?" The silence that followed was its own answer. I thanked Renee. I meant it, actually. She just confirmed everything with a conscience too uncomfortable to lie to me directly, and in a strange way I was grateful for that. I sat down at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold in front of me, and I thought, so here we are. I spent most of that Saturday doing ordinary things. I fixed the sagging left side of the porch, finally. I took Cora to the park after lunch. She chased squirrels and made me hold her jacket and told me about a book she was reading where a girl befriends a wild stallion. I pushed her on the swings and felt the particular tenderness that comes from loving someone who is entirely unaware of the weight you're carrying. Diane came home at 6:15. She brought flowers from a gas station, yellow tulips, slightly wilted. She said Renee was doing better. She asked how the park was. She asked if I was okay because I seemed quiet. "Long day," I said. "I'm fine." I waited 3 more days. I needed to be certain I wasn't acting from the raw place, the place where everything feels like crisis and nothing is measured. My father had taught me that, though he'd been talking about construction sites, not marriages, never make a load-bearing decision under emotional pressure. On Tuesday, I came home from work 2 hours early. I told my assistant I had a family matter. I sat in the kitchen with the door to the garage unlocked and Cora still at school and the house entirely quiet, and I waited for Diane to come home from wherever she actually was. She arrived at 5:48, 2 hours later than she'd said. The moment she walked through the garage door and saw me sitting at the table, something crossed her face. Not guilt, exactly, not yet. It was the look of someone encountering a variable they hadn't accounted for. I said, "Sit down, Diane." She sat. Her bag was still on her shoulder. Her coat was buttoned. She looked at me with an expression that cycled visibly through calculation and something older. Something that might have been recognition, as if she'd been expecting this moment and had simply hoped it would hold off longer. I didn't lead with accusations. I placed what I had in front of her the way you set load-bearing documents on a table, carefully, in order. "I know about Joel," I said. "I know about Barritos. I know about the Tuesdays. I know Renee's been covering for you." She didn't speak. Her hands, folded on the table, went very still. "I know you looked up cabins in Canaan Valley," I said. "I know the seat in your car was moved. I know the perfume you wore that first night wasn't for your sister." A long, complete silence settled over the room. The refrigerator hum. A neighbor's lawnmower somewhere distant. The specific acoustics of a house in which something irreversible is happening. "How long?" I asked. She looked at the table. "Since February." A pause. "We ran into each other at a conference. In January. And then it built." "Built?" I said. "I don't know what you want me to say, Marcus. I want you to tell me whether this is the first time in 12 years. Her eyes came up then, and whatever I was hoping to read in them I didn't find, or maybe I found too much of it, every complicated thing at once. "Yes," she said. "It's the first time." I believed her. I've thought about that since, whether I was wrong to, but I still believe it. Diane had many capacities, but sustained long-term deception had never been among them. This was something that had happened to her from the inside out, a restlessness that had found an outlet and a person willing to be one. "Do you love him?" I asked. She didn't answer for a long time. That was its own answer. "I don't know," she said, which I've come to understand was probably the most honest thing she said in that entire conversation. She didn't know. She was in the middle of something she hadn't fully examined and hadn't yet decided about, which somehow made it both worse and more human. "What were you planning to do?" I said. "The cabin." She closed her eyes. "I don't know. I wasn't planning anything specific. It was just a search. A search for a place to bring a man who isn't your husband while your daughter is in school," I said, still quiet, still level. "That's nothing specific." She started crying then. Not the dramatic kind, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from somewhere under the performance of composure. Real tears, which I was surprised to find I could still distinguish from strategic ones. I watched her cry and I felt something I had not expected. I felt grief. Not rage, grief. 12 years of a life I had believed in, sitting across the table from me, dissolving. "I love you," she said, came out broken, raw. "I don't want to lose this family. I don't want to lose you." "Then why?" "Because I was disappearing," she said. "Marcus, I was disappearing and you were so steady. You were so fine. Everything was fine. And I needed something that wasn't fine. That landed somewhere specific in my chest. I heard it. I even understood it, in the abstract way you can understand a thing that's being used to justify something unjustifiable. I asked her to stop seeing Joel that night. She said yes. I believed that too because she said it with her whole face, not just her words. We sat in that kitchen for another hour. We talked or moved around talking, circling the wound without fully reaching into it. Cora came home at 6:30 and the evening reorganized itself around her, as it always did, dinner and homework and the ritual of bedtime, and Diane and I performed our parental selves with a fluency that felt almost violent in its normalcy. Later, in the dark, I lay beside my wife and stared at the ceiling and tried to locate a version of myself that could find a path through this. A version that could absorb what had happened and still choose what we built. Forgiveness wasn't foreign to me. I'd offered it in smaller denominations before, the argument, the silence, the careless word. This was a different denomination entirely. I told myself, people survive this. I knew that was true. I'd seen it. Pete's second marriage was built on the wreckage of exactly this kind of thing. Not the same players, but the same category of damage. I tried. That's what I want to be understood. I did not give up without trying. The next 3 weeks were a performance of reconstruction. We went to dinner twice, just the two of us. We talked more, not about this specifically, but about the things beneath it. The slow drift, the gap between steady and present, the ways I'd mistaken reliability for intimacy. I heard her. I really did. I could see, clinically, the shape of what had gone wrong and how it had gone wrong. And I also checked her phone. Once. 3 weeks in. Not because I was looking for evidence of continued contact, I told myself that, but because some animal part of me needed to know, and it found what the animal part of me suspected it would find. A text from Joel. 3 days old. 3 words, thinking of you. No response from Diane. But no block either. I put the phone down. I went for a walk that lasted 90 minutes. When I came back, she asked where I'd been, and I said, clearing my head, which was true. My head was very clear. I understood, finally, what Pete had meant on that first night. This was going to cost me something I couldn't afford to lose. I'd been trying to rebuild a structure on a foundation that had failed. And the thing about failed foundations is that every floor you add above them just increases the load on the crack. I told her in April. The porch I'd fixed was already holding steady, level on both sides, new boards, the kind of repair that makes you realize why you've been avoiding it. I didn't do it in a scene. I didn't raise my voice. I'd made the decision 2 weeks earlier, somewhere in the middle of a sleepless night when I'd finally stopped trying to engineer a version of the future where this didn't hurt. There wasn't one. You don't rebuild a house around a load-bearing failure. You assess the damage, you document it, and you make a new plan. I can't, I told her. That was all. She knew what I meant. She cried again. She asked if I was sure. I said yes. She said she'd do anything. I believed her, which made it harder but didn't change it. Anything wasn't the point. The point was that the act of betrayal itself had revealed something about the state of the marriage that forgiveness couldn't unsee. Not the betrayal of what she'd done, but the distance she'd had to be in to do it. That distance hadn't been manufactured by Joel. It had been there, in us, growing through comfortable years I'd mistaken for contentment. We were fair to each other through the process. Surprisingly fair, actually. There were lawyers but no courthouse theater. Diane stayed in the house while we worked out the details. I moved into a rental on the east side of town. A small place with good light and a kitchen I slowly learned to use. We shared Cora with a consistency that I am proud of. Both of us. Cora cried once, early on, in the particular bewildered way of a child who doesn't have language for what's happening yet. We sat on either side of her and told her the truest version of the truth we could offer. That this was something between her parents, that she was loved completely, and that nothing essential would change. 6 months later, Diane called me. It was late October, a Tuesday, which I noticed without comment. She said Joel hadn't worked out. Said it without drama, without soliciting sympathy, just as a fact she was reporting. She said she'd been doing some thinking and she wanted to talk about whether there was still something there, between us. I stood in the kitchen of my small apartment, looking out the window at the parking lot, where a maple was dumping red leaves in no particular direction. I don't think so, I said. She asked if I was sure. I am, I said. And I was, but not from anger. The anger had burned itself down to something quieter months earlier. What I felt when I heard her voice was not hatred, and not residue longing. It was something more like the feeling you get standing in front of a building you've studied for years but will never work on. You can see its good bones. You can appreciate what it was. You know the work of rebuilding it isn't yours to do. I hope things get easier, I told her. I meant it. Renee apologized to me eventually. A long email, 2 pages, that I read twice and then filed without responding to immediately. I responded 3 weeks later with 6 sentences that I meant completely. She'd been caught between sisterhood and honesty and had chosen wrong once and right once, and I wasn't interested in holding it either way. Cora, that Christmas, gave me a drawing of a horse. Brown with a white blaze on its nose. She explained its name, its personality, its particular preference for apples over carrots. It's for your new house, she said. So it's not lonely. I taped it to the kitchen wall. The maple outside my window was bare by then. The parking lot was clear and cold. Some mornings I drank coffee and looked at Cora's horse and thought about the 12 years, the good weight of them, the way a structure can stand beautifully for a long time before the thing that was always missing becomes impossible to ignore. You find out what you're made of in the rebuild. I found out I was made of something I hadn't known I possessed. The capacity to let go of something I'd loved deeply, without bitterness, without revision. To say, that was real and it's over and I'm still here. That's enough. That's more than enough. What makes Marcus's story so quietly devastating isn't the betrayal itself. It's how well designed the blindness was. For years, he had built a life around the assumption that reliability and love were the same currency. He showed up. He fixed things. He was steady. And in being steady, he had stopped being seen, or rather, he had stopped making Diane feel seen. The distance that led her to Joel wasn't manufactured overnight. It had been accumulating through comfortable silences and the comfortable assumption that a functional marriage is a healthy one. The first red flag wasn't the perfume at 2 a.m. It was years earlier, in the slow retraction of genuine connection that both of them had quietly decided not to examine. Marcus's engineering mind allowed him to tolerate ambiguity in the structure of his marriage because the surface held. He never pushed on the foundation. The second red flag that he registered but misread was Diane's lightness. When a partner who has been quietly resentful or emotionally empty suddenly becomes warm, present, and energized, without any identifiable change in circumstances, that transformation has a source. Marcus noticed it and told himself it was good news. In reality, it was diagnostic. She was receiving something elsewhere that she hadn't been getting at home. The lightness wasn't marital recovery. It was emotional supply from a different direction. The first turning point in the story is Cora's innocent mention of the man with the glasses. Children don't know what they're handing you. But that single dinner table remark cracked the plausible deniability that had been holding Marcus's comfortable uncertainty in place. Before that moment, he could still theorize. After it, he was gathering evidence because he already knew the answer and was working backward toward proof. The second turning point, the more structurally important one, is the phone check 3 weeks into the attempted reconciliation. No response from Diane, but no block either. Marcus had been trying, sincerely, to rebuild. But that single unblocked text revealed that Diane hadn't fully closed the door on Joel. She was holding it slightly ajar while accepting Marcus's efforts at repair. That's the moment where forgiveness became architecturally impossible, not because Marcus stopped caring, but because the foundation he was trying to build on had not been cleared. What the story ultimately exposes is the danger of confusing endurance with intimacy. Marcus endured. He was present, reliable, devoted. But at some point in their marriage, those qualities had become a kind of emotional backdrop. Dependable in the way furniture is dependable, noticed only when it moves. Diane had stopped growing toward him and had grown inward instead, into a restlessness she hadn't named until Joel gave it a name for her. Neither of them is a villain. That's the particular cruelty of this kind of story. It's not a tale of good and bad, but of two people who let the distance grow until someone else walked into it. The lesson buried in their failure is one of the simplest and hardest in any long relationship. Proximity is not the same as presence. Marcus had been there, but being there is not the same as being with someone. What the story finally reveals, when you step back from the individual events, is how capable human beings are of building entire parallel realities while sustaining the appearance of a shared one. Diane was, for months, living in two emotional worlds simultaneously. She was a present mother, a warm wife in the mornings, a woman who bought gas station flowers and asked how the park was. And she was also someone planning weekends in Canaan Valley with another man. These weren't in conflict for her, not consciously, or at least not consciously enough to stop. That's not sociopathy. That's the specific capacity people develop when a need goes unmet long enough. They learn to compartmentalize without noticing they've learned it. The accumulation effect is what makes this story structurally inevitable rather than tragic in the conventional sense. It didn't break because of one catastrophic decision. It broke because of hundreds of small ones. Evenings where the conversation stopped at the surface, years where emotional needs were inferred rather than asked about, a dozen moments where either of them could have said something is wrong between us and neither did. Joel wasn't the cause. He was the pressure that exposed what the structure couldn't hold anymore. What Marcus ultimately demonstrates is that love is not sufficient protection against the slow erosion of being known. He loved her. That was never in question. But he had stopped being curious about her, and she had let him, rather than demanding to be found again. What stays with me most about this story isn't the betrayal. It's that quiet moment when Marcus tapes his daughter's horse drawing to the kitchen wall and simply goes back to living. No monologue. No performance of healing. Just a man in a small apartment, learning that a life can be rebuilt in the space left behind by something that mattered. I think what people most underestimate, in stories like this and in real life, is how much damage gets done not in the dramatic moments, but in all the quiet years when both people silently agreed not to go deeper. The loud ending was just the bill arriving for a very long tab.